Hello, everyone, and welcome to VAC Roundtable number 102. If you can believe that, we're up there already. And um, we want to once again welcome another special guest. This one, of course, is another person who's leading the way in ways that other areas, regions of the world can definitely learn from. Basically, they're taking the idea of appellations in local areas and taking it to a whole other realm of understanding, but this time for cannabis. And this conversation is one that because one of our members, Michael Krawitz, happens to be part of the Origins Council. And because of that, we wanted to bring in Genine Coleman, who is basically runs the show there. And she has graced us with her presence. Last week, my council member, Mike Davis, and I were able to see her and a presentation that was there in Sacramento, California, which was absolutely wonderful, enlightening. I unfortunately got stuck in traffic on the way from the Bay, which is a reality of the situation. However, I was definitely able to catch most of the program, and it was enlightening to say the least. So, with all of our conversations, we jump right in, and that's going to be no different. So, we're going to get right to the big question, which is it's a multi-tier question, which is number one. How did cannabis first become part of your life? When did you first hear about it, first try it, and realize it would become part of your personal and professional journey? Welcome, Janine.
Thank you, Etienne, and thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I really appreciate the work you guys are doing, and I'm real excited for this conversation. So, for me, I will credit getting turned on to cannabis to my first love. Um, was a teenager. He was a provider, if you will. And also, we grew up in Chicago, and his family owned a farm in Michigan. So we'd go for weekends for the summer, and I had the perhaps rare experience for an urban kid of getting turned on to cannabis consumption and cultivation at the same time, and growing our plants, kind of guerrilla style in between the corn and the soy. As a child, it was an adventure, and always like to give credit to Mateo for bringing the medicine into my life.
Right on. Well, thank you for sharing that. Next up will be Council Member Michael Davis.
All right. Yeah, would you be able to tell us the history of the Mendocino Appellations Project and Origin Council and how they differ?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Mike. Origins, all about the origins, right? So for me, I got involved first in patient advocacy after a long relationship with the plant from mostly a cultivation standpoint, and was doing that work when legalization started to roll out in California. And so, like a lot of the farmers, kind of poked my head up to get engaged. And it was really exciting to see the community organizing, stepping forward, becoming more public facing, civic engaged. Got turned on to conversations that had been happening at this point. For me, this was around 2014, 15. And there had been conversations in the Emerald Triangle area. So I live in Mendocino County now. I lived in Mendocino County then, just for context. And so that's, one of the three Emerald Triangle regions. And the community had been talking about appellation protections for many years, kind of leading into the legalization, regulation, taxation conversation. And so got involved with a group of folks to co-found the Mendocino Appellations Project. which is a very locally based project focused on Mendocino County and the formation of localized appellations. So it became a pathway for me to both learn and share with the community and explore with the community what appellations are, from a very sort of place-based actual relationship with the community and the place, our relationship to cannabis in Mendocino County. And one of the projects that came out of the Mendocino Appellations Project, really formative, I think, in that we looked at working with the community to think about mapping and how appellations might organize, but specifically from a cultural standpoint. And so looking at how communities organized, and it's different in different places, right? Some places have a very, in rural communities, heavy relationship to watershed, for example. But what we noticed in Mendocino County, it had a lot to do with the growing community about where you came together with people. So volunteer fire department districts, huge coalescing of community and connection, exchange of genetics. Like people would see each other dropping their kids off, at school, or the post office districts, things like this. So these sort of cultural hubs, local ranges, community centers of all kinds, these really became sort of the markers through which the boundaries of the sort of cultural terroir of Mendocino County emerged. And we produced a map with a number of potential proposed appellations as sort of like a thought exercise and a visual um, way to communicate about appellations, which was really powerful. And that took me into working more broadly on policy. I'll just say really quickly, my interest in policy was really piqued by, we had a case, my partner and I. And so going through kind of the legal system while sort of regulations rolling out really piqued my interest. And so got involved in the broader policy advocacy that was happening, joined the board of the California Growers Association, which was connected to MAP, and got involved in state level advocacy. And that organization closed in 2018, and we were in the process of launching a statewide appellations focus organization and realized we wanted to expand the focus to include more broad advocacy, but specifically focused on the legacy farming regions in California. And so that's how the Origin Council formed in 2019. But appellations remains to be a core part of our mission to establish broadly the legal standards-based system for appellations for cannabis. And so, as you said, Etienne, it's something that the world needs, really. There's traditional farming communities all over the world with amazing cultural, traditional knowledge, genetic stewardship, and this is an incredible system to protect, preserve, and carry those traditions forward into a modern commerce, right? And so everything we do to model and share, so that other communities, organizations can hopefully benefit from the frameworks that we're building.
Outstanding. Yes, definitely more regions of the world that are cannabis specific should look at this example specifically to look at ways how to raise that awareness as well as to get the government involved from the local, regional, as well as the national level. All right, next up will be oh, we got a follow-up question. Sorry, Mike D has a follow-up.
Yeah, well, I don't know if we'll maybe cover this later or not, but I started having this thought in my mind regarding the appellations, and then and it was because you mentioned law, and then I started thinking about treaties and kind of, protections and things along that line, and I was thinking, is somewhere along the lines of how is your message getting out there to other people regarding this explanation of the appellations and being able to protect that, genetic, and how, are you receiving any sort of feedback, and what is that feedback, and is this kind of model, so far that you know of just here in California? And have you tried to, or do you know of anybody that's kind of, doing something, outside of just California? Because we know, I mean, we know of like the Nagoya Protocol and the Gradik Treaty and things like that, but I'm just curious, like on the ground,
Yeah.
what have you heard type of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really, to the heart of the work, right? Because modeling it in California is one thing, but bringing it to the rest of the world is ultimately the goal. So Origins Council is one of the co-founding organizations of the National Craft Cannabis Coalition. So to speak a little bit to our base, we represent in Origins Council, the criteria really focus on is independently owned and operated small business. And there's a correlation culturally, right, to the historic cannabis farmers in California, and I would assume that's true broadly. And so we teamed up with organizations, similar organizations in other states. And so we've got partnerships in Washington, Maine, Vermont, um, and we're in a conversation with New York. And so this is part of our conversation there. And we're actually in the process of wrapping up a report that we can publish and share that provides a policy template for other states that are interested, and there is interest in other states, but to my knowledge, no states have really advanced policy yet. But I think it's really important to say, and this is true for California, this is a unique policy area in the cannabis space because it is really truly stakeholder driven. Like we really advocated for works to build over a period of 10 years, the legislation, the regulation. It came from the farmers. It came with subject matter experts. It came in partnership with wine, and really, a very sort of elevated process, I would say, for a lot of cannabis policies, happening in kind of a meat grinder, right? And so we had an opportunity, because it's a long game thing, to build it, I think, in the right way. And so we wanted to really empower other jurisdictions, particularly through the growers, to be able to have the policy to reference because it's really a policy of trade, to your point. Its utility is really about interstate and international commerce and mutual recognition, right, of these protected areas in commerce. And so there's a need for the policy component to match, right, in other jurisdictions, but they need the rationale about why, because it's complex. There are elements that are very exclusionary, right? So that can be controversial in terms of standing up the framework. But there's rationale about why that is. And we'll get into some of that and why there's power in that exclusivity. And so that work is happening in that space. And I really want to give a shout out to Mike, my friend and colleague and a board member at Origins Council, it being an incredible ambassador far and wide, and really carrying, the international side of the work and the knowledge there. And so we're extremely fortunate to have Mike on the board and have been working with him for years.
Thank you for that. Next up will be Doc Lang. Go ahead, Doc.
Yeah, let me find that. Far and wide is where it needs to go. Then hygiene. Okay, question. For people who have never heard the term before, what exactly is a cannabis geographic indication or appellation, and why should consumers and policymakers care?
Great question. So it took me a while to wrap my mind around it because it is so many things at once. It is a standards-based policy framework that serves a function very similar to a certification, but it has the strength of law behind it. It essentially protects a collective intellectual property right for a producing region. It's generally born out of traditional farming areas that have very regionally distinct products that the quality and the characteristic of the product is really born from the specific environmental conditions, the farming practices, the genetic stewardship of that community. produces a very unique product of place. And so this is a framework that protects that culture and those products, and it is a huge deliverable to the consumer because it essentially codifies that the product you receive as a consumer, if it's wearing that appellation label, and so that's kind of the moniker of it. You'll see in Europe, they have protected designations of origin, and they generally have a seal of some kind that will let you know it's an appellation product, or it'll say protected designation of origin. You know, there'll be some official designation on the product label and in marketing and advertising, and the consumer knows, and they can go verify the specific standards, the production standards, the product quality standards, the specific genetics that are behind that product, and the narrative, the story, the people, the places behind it. So the product itself becomes kind of an emissary. It's a huge tool for sustainable rural economic development as part of our mission. And so looking at the agritourism piece and turning consumers on, and they become, you know, if you've got the dang product and they can get consistent access to it, like consumer loyalty happens very naturally, right? And it becomes a very strong bond. And then they become emissaries, right? And they want to come and they want to meet the farmers. And so it feeds into the agritourism. It's a beautiful thing because it's collective, right? And it builds and strengthens community locally, but also the community that exists between consumers and patients and producers. So it's a really pretty incredible tool. You know, some people reduce it to a marketing tool, but obviously it's much more than that. And the pieces about the standards that the farmers define themselves, it becomes a very important tool in the space that we're in with formative regulation, because it really puts forward some of the best things that have come out of the legacy growing community and the medical cannabis movement is that we do care about the quality of the product. And there are specific medicinal constituents, right, in certain genetics and certain products. And so having something that's verifiable and true to, you know, convey to the consumer can trust that, is a really big deal. And so there's an element of kind of honoring, you know, cannabis as a regulator, right, in our body, right, maintaining homeostasis. And so appellations are kind of reflective of that, like, you know, you're self-regulating as farmers. You're putting forward your best, and you're holding yourself to those standards, right, of production and product quality, and kind of standing for that in the marketplace.
Councilmember Kravitz, you have a follow-up.
Thank you.
Thanks, Etienne. Ginny, it's great for you to join us. It's been a long time in the making. I really appreciate you coming on. These are a lot of subjects and bits of information that, you know, maybe people have heard, you know, especially outside of California, maybe on the periphery, but not much directly about. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things sort of from the heart here. You know, the drug war, first of all, two concepts. One is that the drug war has altered the way we do things in an adverse way. And two is that we really don't know weed as much as we think we do. So I'll throw those out there first and then say what I mean. The first one, you know, the growing indoors under lights, smoking cannabis instead of taking it as a hashish candy, using cannabis as an extract with a variety of other herbal medications in smart ways. These are all things that have changed. You know, we used to use herbal cannabis in very smart ways. It was available in the pharmacy, and it was driven out of the pharmacy by the drug war. And in its place, we had this sort of prohibition dogma that has come in. And one of the key things about it that I think is worth mentioning here is that reliance on THC value, which really grew out of prohibition and marketing on the street, if you will. And people have learned to buy cannabis based on THC, which brings me to my second point, which is that you don't know cannabis as much as you think you do if you're buying cannabis based on THC. Because we're going to have increasingly more and more cannabis that's going to show up, that's going to blow people's minds and win awards, that's going to have a lower THC value relative to some other other competitors. And that's going to happen more and more, I think, in increasing ways. And the cannabis that was available before the drug war sort of really kicked in the 60s and 70s and eradicated cannabis in Hawaii and places like that almost completely. We had some phenomenal cannabis that was very unique and different, and we will again. And it may be from other places around the world, and certainly from California, Hawaii. I really, say this from the heart, and I would tell people out there, when they start writing songs about cannabis, different varieties of like Panama Red, it's a really great song. New Riders of Purple Sage. Google it. Much love. Really, thanks, Ginny.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I really agree. And I think this is part of why appellations are exciting, because there's an element of research that will help, sort of elucidate and bring that forward.
And yeah, that's what's missing, because a lot of the stories are oral, and we need to get them documented, because the older people are dying off, and even the younger people. So it's something that has to be sustained and maintained, but especially documenting elder history first where possible. All right, Mary Lynn, you have our next question.
You know what? And I think I'm going to pass here because if we'll notice, I've got the same question as number 3. So I'll come on later for my later
No,
question.
no. I put if you look,
Oh,
I put it in. See, I
Oh, now
changed it.
my
It's in there.
Okay, now my all right, come on. Come on. It's my laptop is being stubborn right now. Okay. No, I still can't get down to the bottom. All right, is this my 4? All right. Sorry, a little slow here. At the
Okay.
present time, is California the only state that's actively involved in cannabis? Yeah, the only one involved in the cannabis appellation process.
Yeah, to my knowledge, there's conversations happening with farmers and I think to some extent with policymakers. I don't believe any legislations move forward. I think a lot of folks are kind of watching and to see California has been 10 years in the making. I think they want to see the program open. We're on the precipice of that program actually opening. It's important to acknowledge that it's been a lot of policy making and a tremendous amount of stakeholder engagement. And I do want to flag this is only one of 2 programs for California cannabis under the purview of the California Department of Food and Agriculture. Otherwise, we're under the Department of Cannabis Control, which says a lot in the word there. And it's part of our missive to have cannabis cultivation activities acknowledged as agricultural activities legally and to be regulated as such. And the agency has done an incredible job of stakeholder engagement. They really prioritize that. So it's taken some time to develop the policy. And so the program is anticipated to launch later this year or next year. And I think, those that are tracking it, and we have received engagement from as far away as France tracking it, which they offered high compliments regarding the framework that was put in place. And I mean, it says a lot. France doesn't hand out compliments about appellations very often, especially to cannabis regulators and growers who are, working to establish this system here. So I take that as a high compliment. So I think there's a lot of attention on it as the program launches. And, further proof of concept, right, as petitioners step forward and, actually are awarded appellations. And then, I think part of the true test will be seeing how it performs in the market. Do consumers understand? Does it increase the value? Does it help consumers connect with craft producers? And so I think there's, I mean, cannabis policy and market development is such a slippery slope, right? And I think a lot of people have taken a lot of hits. So I think there's a lot of folks like watching and letting the model play out a little bit and see what they can learn from it before they advance it at home.
All
Thank
right. Thank you for that. Next up will be Michael Crowitz with our next question.
Thanks, Etienne. Yeah, so this is I would call this a transition question. And again, to folks out there that think that we're at the end of the road, we legalized cannabis, everything's done that needs to be done. No, I'd say we've really just entered into the transition phase where I'm not sure how long it'll take even to get to the other end of it. but things will, I think, look different there than here. But how do you get there, right? So it's been my question for quite a while. So it leads me into this question. California's legacy cannabis producing communities help build the modern cannabis movement, yet many are struggling today. What are the biggest threats facing those communities? And how can geographic indications, appellations, help preserve both their economy and the culture?
That's a great question, and I really appreciate it because it gets to the heart of how appellations can be a pragmatic tool to mitigate loss of cultural identity, loss of region, loss of land, loss of genetic resources. So the crux of the challenge on the ground is economic. It's a very challenging market. It's hard to get market access for small farmers. There's a lot of attrition. We ran the numbers recently. California at its peak had about 5,000 independently owned and operated small farms licensed. We're at about half that. And so we've seen a lot of attrition, and with it, a diaspora, right, of these families. These are family farmers, right? And so they're moving on to find work. California is extremely expensive. And so as they leave, their land's up for sale, and who comes in, right? Because the thing is, with regions like the Emerald Triangle, Mendocino, Humboldt, Trinity, Big Sur, the reputational value has been established. It's been established in the international market. And so there's value to the region itself. And so that can become a very dangerous situation in terms of, predatory land acquisition. And the aspect of the Appalachian system that we had to advocate, and we had to run legislation on this to essentially ensure that it was a traditional system, very much modeled off the European system, that it was terroir based, that it was exclusive to outdoor farmers who are cultivating with the elements. So who are not cultivating in hoop houses, in greenhouses, indoor, who are really working with the natural environment, essentially ties that intellectual property right, that collective intellectual property right, to the land under their feet. It's not codifying the value of something that can be grown in a pot and taken and moved somewhere else. It is really holding ground for folks in terms of their communities, their identities, their land stewardship. And that is a really powerful tool to weather the storm, so to speak. As policy reform continues to evolve, and eventually we'll have interstate commerce, we'll eventually have direct-to-consumer sales, we'll have some of these really fundamental market access tools that small farmers need to kind of build back the value, frankly, that has been drained out of the system with the way that it's rolled out to date. And so, there's all those pieces, and just the fact that marketing and branding is extremely expensive, and penetrating consumer awareness is extremely challenging. And so being able to collectivize that and have it be a regionally based thing pulls in resources from local government and state government, grant resources, all kinds of resources to help collectivize the marketing push, right, and lift. It's a heavy lift. And so it has so much to offer. It's really an incredible tool.
Right on. All right. I'm up next. So you've spent years studying legacy cannabis genetics. How important is it to preserve these heirloom cultivars before they disappear, and what would be lost if we don't?
Thank you for that question. So just by way of context, we had the amazing fortune of collaborating with scientific and academic researchers to apply for a grant from the state of California that's coming from the Proposition 64 framework, provides for some cannabis tax funds to go towards academic research for cannabis. So we were awarded our grant to study legacy cannabis genetics. And so we're in the third year of it now, and the event that Etienne and Mike attended was a dissemination event. We had preliminary findings that we presented to a wide base of stakeholders, from regulators to legislative staff, movement folks, industry people, academics. And I cannot emphasize like how critical this moment is for the value and diversity of genetics that California and other communities worldwide have been stewarding, and the risk. It's an annual plant. We lose these genetics so quickly. And the market forces, the attrition, we're kind of hemorrhaging diversity. We're losing it. And I think it's such a powerful moment, because with the federal rescheduling order, right, and having the federal government come forward, and however you may feel about how that's unfolding, the one thing that I think is incredible, it needs to be acknowledged, is the first time that the federal government, at least in recent years, and I mean, through the legacy of the drug war, is acknowledging, the need, the obligation to provide access to patients to medical cannabis, and acknowledging state licensed medical cannabis businesses as stewarding and providing that. And so there is a direct correlation between the diversity of these genetics and the medicinally relevant constituents and the unique combinations therein, right? We talk about the entourage effect, and I mean, talk about a rabbit hole to study for the rest of your life, and you'll never get to anything conclusive. And looking at the interaction of the endocannabinoid system with the entourage effect of different genetics and different phenotypic expressions, I mean, it's really quite infinite. And so when you have something so valuable like that, yet so sort of undiscovered in a way, not understood, the need to preserve that diversity, not just of what we have, but the diversity of innovation to continue, right? And so maintaining the stewardship among many, right? And the flexibility for folks to continue innovating, exchanging genetics is absolutely crucial. And it's in California facing, I think, the largest threat that it's faced since really we've amassed this wealth of genetic diversity over the past several decades. So there's a lot of risk.
All right. Next up will be Mike D.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Put the Puffco down. All right. Woo, all right. So around the world, products like champagne, Parmigiano oregano, and tequila are protected by internationally recognized geographic indications. Do you envision cannabis eventually receiving the same level of international protections? And what obstacles stand in the way?
Yeah, that's a kind of a nice tie into what I was just saying, because I think absolutely, in terms of the vision, is for the appellation designated cannabis in California and other places to be recognized in the international market, to be taken seriously. And that's why the system that we work from a policy standpoint is much more akin to the European system. It has, all of the standards that are really, producer driven around production standards, land stewardship standards, business standards are an opportunity, cultivar standards, product quality standards, taking it to that level so that it would be taken seriously in the international market. And, again, I'll just say it again, because it's like kind of a really amazing moment to receive acknowledgement from France and the agricultural ministry, acknowledging the system, and that it is, I think one step towards acknowledging, yes, we're on the right track, right, for these products to be taken seriously in that context, and that it's a solid model to build upon if that's the kind of access that these producing communities are aiming for. And I think there's a correlation between the way that the United States treats and views traditional and complementary medicine with things like geographical indications. Like there are paradigms, right? And so in the intellectual property world, the United States is very much in a trademark paradigm. It's very much about individual businesses' intellectual property in conflict with collective intellectual property. And so there's a significant lift there to, I think we have the advantage of being on a kind of a state by state level with the policy so that we can get other states to come in and buy in, right, and stand up appellation systems that are comport with what we've built here in California. And, hopefully that's a way to leverage on the federal level, eventually a recognition and system that can play right through international treaties in that kind of mutual recognition of these products. So it's very ambitious, but I think it's very worth pursuing. And I think, I mean, if the federal government can acknowledge herbal cannabis as medicine, then I think, I feel like there's a kind of a anything's possible, magic to cannabis. And so I just trust the plant and go where she takes me.
And she drags us kicking and screaming into the future. Okay. Next up will be Doc Lang.
Future looks bright. I gotta wear shades. Okay, as the United States moves closer to federal cannabis reform, are we at risk of creating a market dominated by commodity cannabis, or is it still time to build a system that rewards regional quality, sustainability, and small producers?
I think so. I think the risk is greater than ever. We've been engaged around the Schedule 3 order and the approach, that's rolling out with, this DEA registration that just closed. And it really, the lack of information, the nature of sort of the questions and sort of self-incriminating questions that the DA is asking you to put forward, the sort of toggle between adult use and medical regulation regimes and how that interfaces with the Schedule 3, Schedule 1 situation is essentially a giant barrier to entry for a lot of our people, right? Because we are working with communities who have been historically impacted by the war on drugs generationally. And so, a lot of our folks aren't stepping forward. And I think this goes back to, if that order and what is unfolding now through the administrative hearing is truly the United States stepping up to meet the mandate of medical cannabis access, then these producers and products must be available to patients broadly. And so I think, the medical access issue has always been the thing that has driven policy reform for cannabis. And I'm really glad that it's back to driving, right, the conversation. And I think the consumer is only growing, right? Like there's only more people getting turned on to cannabis. And as they get turned on to cannabis, becoming more discerning about cannabis, right? And so I think that's sort of an inevitability. I think that's on our side. I think the patients and consumers are, ultimately will prevail. And ultimately they want broad access to as much diversity of product and product quality and genetics that we do, so.
All right. Michael Krawitz has a follow-up.
Apologize for that. I'm a little bit lost here. So many thoughts in my mind. I was gonna ask a question and I swear I just can't. Oh yeah, so yeah, I now. Wow, it's all coming back to me. I don't want to get into like a huge, deep question here, but I somehow maybe take the question that sounds deep that I'm about to ask and make it a very light one. But we have over time, we've had a couple of bills before Congress. Generally, the mantra is descheduling. And I guess, as you're talking, it just strikes me, I'm not sure, like, about what they're doing and how that lines up with what we're doing. So the track that you just discussed and described is sort of matching up our, like you say, sort of patent trademark driven world with this appellations world. And just for those listening, Google the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Nagoya Protocol, the GRATIC Treaty, and study all the related issues, and you'll find that there is, a way that these things are done internationally that already, without even a special cannabis appellation, which is nice, but even without it, you already have protections internationally if your country signs on to that. And the U.S. hasn't signed on to any of that. And it doesn't look like we're going to sign on to any of that. But I think that concerns me less, just so people know, after I learned how things sort of work in the real world, which is if all these countries are following all those rules and they're doing trade with us, then we kind of have to follow them as well. So I guess the first part of the question is, do we track in that, sort of like, is there a way that the cannabis appellation certification mark cannabis from California can actually play in the same playground as Nagoya, certified Convention on Biological Diversity, registered thing? And then the second part is, would descheduling help? Is that really in the, or do we need a whole different, again, not to get really deep, but is there another kind of federal change that we would need, beyond descheduling that would allow us, do we have to fix something else huge as the cannabis movement, just so we can have our trade?
Yeah, I mean, I think using as many tools as possible, especially since we are between worlds, so to speak. And so utilizing collective marks and certifications in addition to, the appellation system, I think is something that should be investigated and pursued. And being able to kind of, leverage into international trade any which way and sort of ignite again the consumer base from other countries, right? I think as part of our pathway to accessing some of these conventions, frankly. So I think, it's not a linear path by any stretch of the imagination. But I think, you use as many tools as possible in the process to get where you want to go. And then, I mean, I think descheduling needs to happen. I think from my perspective and working with farmers, small farmers, the tools of prohibition still at play, right? And so the extreme cost and hoops that one has to go through to cultivate an existing quarter-acre patch is ridiculous, right? It's being regulated as though you're bulldozing an entire watershed to stand up, like a maybe a strip mall or maybe, a manufacturing facility with like some kind of volatile chemicals. It's not like that, right? It's really disproportionate. And so I think descheduling would clear the path for normalization in the regulatory space, right? And so getting farmers to be recognized as farmers and to be regulated as agriculture, because there are so many resources that we don't have access to, that agriculture has access to. Particularly, you talk about, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There's a lot of risks that come with conventional agriculture, particularly in the intellectual property space. But there's also a lot of access and, lower barriers to entry. And I think that kind of normalization is the only thing that will actually, at the end of the day, cause illicit cultivation to really actually taper and die off. And as long as it's controlled and for the elite, there will always be a black market. It's widespread access and widespread ability for personal cultivation. I really appreciate you guys taking that on in the context of the Schedule 3 conversation and advocating. Personal cultivation is the heart of access, right? And so I think, descheduling is really important for all those reasons.
All right, Mary Lynn Methry, you're up next.
Alrighty. Yeah, this has been fascinating, Janine. There's so many questions out there, and I'm always just a fan of outdoor growing compared to indoor, and you start thinking about, people getting some certain seed that they're going to do, and then it depends on where they're planting it in, and whatever, it makes a difference. And for that variety, but it's like, get to the location where they're grown, what soil they're grown in, et cetera. It is so important. And I'm with you wholeheartedly, descheduling. And I also like that word, just because when people say legalizing, it's just like, you think, how do you legalize a plant? That's just stupid. We never should have put it in the schedule. So let's just get it out of there and let it be a plant again. And when you think of it as an herbal property too, I don't see indoor fields of chamomile, or indoor grows of chamomile, or this and that. It's like the poor plant. So anyway, getting back to my question that I'm supposed to ask, um, Origins Council has worked extensively with rural communities. What lessons have you learned about balancing environmental stewardship, economic development, and regulatory compliance without pricing small farmers out of the market?
Yeah, that's the key. Sustainability is in our mission. It's part of our work. And we've been in some really interesting spaces and battles really around this issue. So for example, California's got something called the California Environmental Quality Act. It is a major piece of, a whole series of laws that seek to, in the best iteration of it, preserve and protect our natural resources and our cultural resources as well in the face of development. However, it can be leveraged in a very punitive way that, in my opinion, ends up working against the goal. And so in California, in order to cultivate cannabis or open any cannabis business, each individual business has to go through site-specific CEQA analysis, which is, for a rural cultivator, particularly in the North Coast, when you've got legacy issues about, logging, right, and some of the things that were done on land to accommodate that legacy activity that has nothing to do with the farmer who owns the property now and who's trying to be a steward, right, of the property. And they've got to foot, tens of thousands, upward to hundreds of thousands of dollars in mitigations to deal with some of those legacy issues, is one extreme set of barriers to entry for folks. And so, you're talking about people that are stewarding the land, and if you're driving them out of land ownership and out of their communities because of the regulatory hoops, the environmental regulatory hoops that they have to get through, and then suddenly all the land's for sale, and suddenly you've got, interlopers from outside buying up the land and doing who knows what, you've completely run counter to the intention, right, of the environmental protection frameworks that California proudly put forward for cannabis cultivation. So again, I think, the descheduling, right, and acknowledging cannabis as agricultural activity, but also retaining, and this is again, why appellations are so powerful, because of the standards, and that they're community-driven standards. You're talking about communities that pride themselves on environmental stewardship and regenerative farming, and they're able to codify those values in a way that the consumer can verify and that it's legit. I mean, they're stewarding their land, right, in their communities and their watersheds. And, there's a lot of, I think, wisdom to empowering the community to let them sort of self-regulate, because these people love their place. They love their environment and their community, and they're trying their best to hold on to that, right? And steward that land and pass it on to the next generation. And that's a really powerful opportunity that I think, some of the environmental regulation requirements that have rolled out in California is really undermining. So, it's a 1.0 version of things, right? So we'll continue to iterate.
All right. Next up will be Michael Crowitz.
Thank you, Etienne. So uh, I want to rewrite this question a little bit on the fly here, but Veterans Action Council, we've got a list that we're going to be doing a little bit more, I think, hopefully with Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America to promote this list. We've been working on it sort of behind the scenes for quite a while. Well over 100 veterans, military veterans over time that have given significant contributions to the cannabis space, with such notables as Timothy Leary, the one that won the court case that found the Marijuana Tax Act unconstitutional, Jack Hare, the well-known sort of grandfather of hemp, the hemper, and Dennis Perone, the again well-known sort of father of medical marijuana with Prop 215 and the medical marijuana movement in San Fran and in California. Anyway, with veterans basically everywhere in this movement and everything, but still, our question is, what opportunities do you see for veterans to contribute to and benefit from geographically protected cannabis regions? I mean, what do you see as maybe special to veterans' abilities or just good opportunities that veterans might be able to take advantage of for one reason or another as veterans?
Yeah, I
If
think
any.
there's a lot of things that I could say, but the thing that really like comes forward as the most important, and I think you all are a testament to that, is uh, an internalized, deeply profound understanding of the importance of teamwork, right? Of working collectively, collective action, and appellations are collective work. And I think our American culture doesn't always prioritize that or understand it. And so I think the wisdom that veterans have from their lived experience of working as a part of a team is really a profound thing to help communities organize, right? And the nuanced understanding of policy, right, is another contributor. And I think the compassion piece is huge, again, because for me, cannabis is first and foremost a medicine, and there is a priority for me in cannabis appellations really prioritizing that, right, and preserving and protecting the medical utility. And so I think veterans have a unique um, authority, right, in terms of speaking to the importance of this kind of framework, right, and what it delivers to the world, right, and particularly to patients. So that's how I would frame it.
All right. I have our next question, uh, which is where to go? Let's look away from me there. All right. Has the proposition of establishing a national or worldwide cannabis seed bank ever come up in your conversation with your affiliate growers?
I want to take a moment and acknowledge the legacy cannabis genetics study. And in particular, we have been pursuing this research through community-based participatory research methodology, which is something that came out of the public health field. And it pursues a partnership approach to research where communities that are being engaged by researchers or being studied by researchers are not an object of study, but a partner in the research, right? And collaborating to ensure that the research is relevant, that it's done in an ethical fashion and of benefit to the community. And so part of what we've been exploring through that research methodology is different models for community engagement. And so we established a community advisory board of 13 individuals who represent, and I think they do a damn good job of representing the diversity of California legacy cannabis from urban to rural, women, men, queer people, diversity, right, in every sense of the way. And speaking from their lived experience and from the experience of their communities have really kind of opened up a different level of conversation than, we're working generally with licensed operators who are head down, right? They're trying to survive. And so the ability to kind of like zoom out and have a conversation about specifically genetics, specifically legacy genetics and preservation, And the relationship that those individuals and researchers have internationally has really brought forward a pretty exciting conversation about, how can we work more internationally with folks that are, innovating and preserving and stewarding genetics. And so there's kind of a real-time conversation happening, and I'd love to have more conversation with you all because I know you're, contributing a lot to that space as well. And I think it's timely. And so, yeah, there's conversations about, an international convening of sorts for breeders and folks that have been like really stewarding legacy genetics internationally. And I think it needs to happen. And it needs to happen in the United States probably as well. Just think about like go to the motherlands, right? And pay it forward that way.
All right, next up will be Mike D. Mike Davis, you're up.
Yep, I'm coming. I'm ready to clean out the old Puffco. Getting ready for another one. Okay, so looking ahead in 10 years, if everything goes according to your vision, what does success look like for the Origin Council, and how different would the cannabis industry be from what we see today?
I think it would be different, but look a lot more like it used to look in terms of the diversity of growers of all kinds in all places, and patients being a priority, and consumers really driving market access and diversity of products, small business dominated, and a really robust, thriving international craft cannabis market. I think it's all about access for the producers and the innovators, the breeders, the craft medicine makers, and on the other side of that, the patients and the consumers. And that's really the vision. And I think it's an inevitability. I think it's going to take a lot of work, but I think consumers and patients will demand it, and I think they will prevail at the end of the day. And we've seen that, time and again for all kinds of products. And, people are so passionate about cannabis, so that passion will drive that. I really believe that. So 10 years is a chunk of time, but not at the same time. So we'll see how far we can get.
No, I mean it's Michael and Emmett started off in 2008 to make the change by 2020 for medical cannabis worldwide. So, decades of planning sometimes can yield results that will literally change the world. So, that's something we never forget. Well, Genine, thank you so much for joining us for an amazing conversation, and I hope everybody got out of it as much as I did. Of course, it's a great learning experience, and I hope others will see this and replicate it in their areas, regions, and places around the world, so that more of the history, the appellations, as well as the saving of the genetics, right, which is something that's key. We're missing whole swaths of generations of cannabis, including myself. I have one that's tattooed on me, and that one's gone already. So it's just one of those things that happen along the way because they're annuals. We don't save them, and hopefully we'll one day arrive where there is that type of protection as well as the saving of those genetics outright. So thank you. I would like to thank all of our council members for joining us tonight: Mary Lynn Mathry, Doc Lang, Michael Crowitz, Michael Davis, and myself, Etienne Fontan. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for VAC Roundtable number 102. Genine Coleman, Origins Council. Thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you in a little bit. Have a great night.
Thank you.